Okay, thank you very much, Alfred, and welcome everyone to today's Brown Bag, where I will be talking about 10 terrible user requirements. Now, why am I talking about this? So, as everyone in the room knows, my name is Collis, and I'm a full stack developer here at Salsita. What you may not all know, some of you do, but I used to be, Collis, a principal consultant at Actica Consulting, and that means that for 10 years of my life, I'm perhaps older than I look, I was a business consultant rather than a developer. And as part of that work, I wrote requirements documents, I reviewed requirements documents, I procured solutions to meet requirements documents. It wasn't the only thing I did, but I did see the requirements process from lots of different angles. And now I'm here, I'm working as a developer, and I'm seeing the requirements from the point of view of someone who has to implement them. For the menu today, in advance of our real food arriving, I'm going to just go over what is a user requirement anyway? Why do we need user requirements? What would be in a good user requirement? And then the clickbaity bit, which is, of course, while you're all here, 10 terrible user requirements. And I hope you won't be too disappointed that they aren't verbatim quotes from certain customers. They are a bit more generic than that. But I'm sure some of you will recognize some of the themes that I'm going to go over. And finally, some conclusions. So, what are user requirements anyway? And I should probably say that this is my personal view. There isn't a formal definition and a standard that everyone has to follow, but this is my personal view from my years of experience from different angles looking at requirements. For me, user requirements describe what a user needs to accomplish or deliver. They should not be technical. All users should be able to understand them, and some representative of the users needs to own them. And that bit is quite important. The users themselves need to take some responsibility for these requirements. As a developer, we should not be owning the requirements for someone else. And there are various types of user requirements. And this is starting to be a bit more traditional. There are functional user requirements around user interactions. What does a user actually need to do? Why do they need to do it? When they're interacting with the solution, what are they actually going to be doing? There are non-functional requirements, which are characteristics like reliability, scalability, maintainability, characteristics of the solution as a whole. And there are usually some constraints. They could be external limitations, they could be formal standards that the solution needs to follow. And a set of user requirements also need context. You can't just throw a requirement out without any context and expect people to implement it without having questions. Why do we need this solution in the first place? When do we need it? How quickly do we need it? Because that in itself can drive prioritization of requirements. If timeline is actually more important than depth, then you need to adjust the requirement accordingly. And who needs this solution? Whose requirement is it? Who is the owner? Whose money is it, fundamentally? There will almost certainly be dependencies on other projects, on other technical solutions that already exist. And again, these aren't really requirements of the user, they are dependencies of the project. And it's also important to keep a record of assumptions. There are bound to be some assumptions, depending on how mature a particular project or idea is. The assumptions could be very general, or they could be very specific assumptions about numbers that need to be validated. We were talking about user requirements, but who is a user? What does that really mean? And essentially the needs of anyone who is going to interact with the solution to this requirement need to be considered. you need to think quite hard about exactly who the users are before you get started. And for any non-trivial solution, there will usually be different types of user. Different types of user with different needs, different types of user who have different importance, different types of user who you may or may not have contact with. So if you are talking to users, it's a bit harder to talk with potential customers who don't exist yet than it is to talk to the management who are paying for the product and are very keen for it to happen. And it is important to make sure that you do recognize and capture the requirements of all of the different sorts of users, including the ones who don't have loud voices, because they may actually be more important to the development of the solution as a whole. And in terms of what a user requirement looks like, there are standard forms of wording that I'm sure you'll recognize along the lines of a type of user shall be able to do something in order to achieve something. And it is important that you understand which user you're talking about. You need to understand what they need to do, and you need to understand why they need to do it. So, why do we need user requirements? Users, at least the ones that are involved in creating the requirements, know what they're going to get. Developers know what they're going to build. QA know what they need to test and how to validate it, and project managers have lots of paperwork to keep them happy. And I should say PMs here is definitely project managers and not product managers, who have a rather more involved role to play. And the benefits you get out of clear requirements: you have a common understanding of what it is your project is, a clear scope and objectives, and you can actually make sensible plans as opposed to a blank sheet of paper and guesswork. If you have poor requirements, things can go horribly wrong. You almost certainly get scope creep. Someone thinks of something really important that they'd forgotten about when they first described their need. There's not enough budget and resources to deliver what they really need because you didn't think about it in the first place. It's not what the users expect. It's not what they actually need. It doesn't help them do their job. Or if they're customers, it doesn't help them interact with the product and buy things. And it's also hard to test if you don't know what it is you're supposed to be testing, what it is that you're supposed to be doing. It can be a waste of time, money. It can be frustrating for everyone involved. General fail for a project if you have terrible user requirements. And I hear some of you thinking, because you think very loudly, but everyone's agile now. So some of the things I've been saying, you might think, well, actually, we don't have long, detailed requirements documents signed off a year before the project starts. No, we don't. We don't need a rigid change management process because we have sprints and we change things every 2 weeks. No, we don't. But it's really important to still understand what the users need. If we have a dynamic, flexible approach to development, we also need to have a dynamic, flexible approach to requirements, but that doesn't mean ignoring them. That means continuing to produce quality requirements that actually describe the user need, but doing it dynamically and flexibly. And I've seen it written in quite a few places that Agile is different. We have user stories and not user requirements. But actually, if you look at what a user story is supposed to be and what a good user requirement is supposed to be, they are pretty much the same information. They need to convey that same information about who the user is, what they need to do, why they need to do it. The biggest difference is that user stories have expectation that they will change during their life. We don't have something signed off, but it's something that will be refined during life of a particular development cycle. And also what's really quite important for us is that developers are more likely to be updating user stories than the traditional user requirements. And as a result, I think it's even more important that developers understand what makes a good user requirement and what makes a bad one. And before I go on to a description of what makes a good user requirement, we're going to pause for a moment because some food has arrived. Hopefully there's still some for me afterwards, but I will get on with the presentation. What makes a good user requirement? I'll talk about terrible ones in a bit, but what do we actually need to make a good user requirement? So here are some things that I think makes a good user requirement. First of all, that it's atomic. I don't mean in the Temelin sense. I mean that it addresses a single need in an individual requirement, not that you have lots and lots of requirements listed in the same sentence. And believe it or not, I had a case in the past where a significant amount of rework was required because of the positioning of a comma in a particular long sentence. It really is important that you have small blocks of requirement when you come to implement them to make sure everyone understands. They need to be concise. There shouldn't be lots of waffle. You shouldn't repeat things. And yes, this does mean that they take time and effort to write. They're not just notes from a whiteboard. They need to be unambiguous. Every reader of the requirement needs to understand what it means, and you need to understand this in exactly the same way. It needs to be feasible. So often you might find people having visions of what they want their product to do, of what they want the solution to do, that just aren't feasible. Either not at all, or not in the month they're giving you to do it, or not within the 50k budget they're giving you to do it. It's important that you're not living in dreamland and getting a completely unfeasible requirement. It needs to be testable in some way or other. We need to be able to know whether we have actually delivered this user's requirement. If something is so poorly written we can't tell whether the solution delivers it or not, it's not very useful. Is it justified? Why do we need this requirement? If we don't understand why we need it, do we really need it in the first place? Who's actually going to make use of this feature if they don't actually have a reason for it? They need to have some form of prioritization. In the real world, you can't expect to deliver every single requirement that everyone has. You need to understand what's most important, what you're going to do first, and it also needs to be solution independent. The user requirement is about what the users want and the users need to do. It should not start describing the technical solution. So now, here is the clickbaity title, 10 terrible user requirements. And I've got a bit of a countdown for you. But first of all, a bit of back to reality. I've talked about what makes good user requirements, and I have been in a position before where I've been in big, long, complicated acquisition projects where you do have a huge, comprehensive requirement set. I'm not sure if anyone here will have come across Rational Doors, which is a horribly complicated to use database that exists solely to cross-reference large numbers of requirements. Big waterfall projects do this. We don't operate in that environment to some extent. I'm quite glad we don't operate in that environment. We don't have full-time requirements managers. We need to live with that. We cannot rely on timely and high-quality requirements from our customers. Now, I'm sure that there are some customers that are better at this than others, but we have to expect that there will be times when the requirements we get from our customers are defective or deficient in some way, and we need to help them understand what their requirements really are. We need to be able to recognize weak requirements. We need to deal with them before we work on a solution so that we don't waste our time. So now on to the countdown. At number 10, the user shall be able to X so that they can then do Y and Z. So X in this case might well be a clear requirement, but the justification we have here is that Y and Z are potentially clear requirements as well. If Y and Z involve the same solution as X, then we need to make sure that Y and Z are described separately, and we need to capture the dependency between them. We need to recognize that we need to do X so that we can then do Y and Z, so that we don't only implement X and not Y and Z, and so that we don't implement Y and forget about X, because you can't do Y without X. We need to have some understanding of the relationship between them. And number 9, the user shall be able to search for X so that they can view X. The problem with this is it doesn't explain why they need to view X in the first place. It's a circular definition. It's saying we need to do something for the sake of doing something. If we have a requirement like this, we want to try and understand what the real reason for X actually is, and understand what the benefits to the user are. Does this requirement have a logical justification or not? And if it doesn't, we should be going back to our customers and asking them whether this is a real requirement, because no one seems to know why we need to do it. And this also hooks into considering the types of user carefully. We need to think about who needs to view X as well as Y. For anything other than a small system, small solution, you will have multiple types of users who have different needs, and it may be that only certain users need to be able to view X, or maybe that everyone needs to. We don't know without further information. At number 8, I'm sure you've seen this. User requirements that say the solution should use React and GraphQL or whatever other technical solution you may wish to think of. It is not a user requirement. It's possible that it's a valid project constraint. It's possible that it has already been decided that we should be using this as a solution because we already have it half-built product using these technologies, but it is not a user requirement. The user should not care whether we use React or not as a user. The management of our customers as owners of a project may have reasons to prefer certain technical solutions, but they should not be appearing as requirements for the user, and this is the sort of thing that should be decided separately from the description of what the solution needs to do. Another example of this might be saying that the user shall be able to interact with charts produced using HighCharts or some other similar library because they have a HighCharts license. And again, that's something that is not really a user requirement. It is a technical constraint that if they've paid for something, they might feel they need to use it. It's possible that you could deliver a similar experience without using HighCharts, but using something else that's free. And that should be something the solution is free to explore. We need to remove any user requirements that are purely defining a technical solution. And if it's actually an allusion to some other characteristic of the solution which is important to the user, it needs to be written like that. So for taking that HighCharts example, the user may well need to interact with dynamic charts, but how those are implemented is not the same thing as what the user needs to do. And number 7. Oh, look, there's a pretty picture. We've given you a mock-up. What more do you need? Well, quite a bit, actually. Quite apart from the fact that the mock-ups we get might not be consistent with each other, or they might be several months out of date. A picture by itself is not going to tell you everything you need to know. If you get a requirement like this, which is principally a picture, you need to imagine what other data might look like. It's almost certain that they've used a simple example when producing the picture, but the real data might be more complicated than that. And you need to imagine some of the more complicated cases in the same picture and decide whether they would actually work or not. And you need to consider all interactions. Unless the requirement is literally the user needs to view something and it's a picture of the view, there will be some level of interaction between the user and whatever is displayed on the screen, and you need to know what is expected. And again, the picture itself is not going to do that. I know that in things like Figma, you can have interrelated actions and you can have interactive mock-ups, but I'm thinking more of people who will just send you a picture and expect you to get on with it. At number 6, the user must be able to do the same as Y, but on a new platform. So this is really about why you're doing a project and not about what the user needs to do. Is Y so good that all its current features are necessary? Nothing can be improved? And we need to review and challenge the current requirements for Y. It's overall saying do the same as Y, but what does that really mean? And are there really any requirements? If we can't challenge the current requirements, they don't exist, we will need to write them anyway, even if it's to do the same as Y, because otherwise you need to understand exactly what Y does in order to copy it. And the best way of doing that is capturing what the user needs that Y meets are. And number 5, you may well have seen this one before. We'd like you to build something, but we can't tell you anything more about it. We might give you a 2 or 3 word headline. There, we want to build this feature next, but we don't know what it means. And when you get a requirement like this, we need to be aware that there are almost certainly some big issues associated with it that no one's thought of yet. It might be that they're expecting you to do it. You need to engage with the users and understand what they actually are thinking of before you build anything, because a really vague high-level idea is not a user requirement that tells you what a user really needs to do and why. And we need to make sure that we are prompting our customers to give us a bit more information, or doing the work for them, but getting them to sign up to it is another approach. If they expect us to develop requirements, then they need to buy into the requirements before we actually start building anything based on them. And there is an opposite to this. Sometimes we get requirements that are not short and atomic. They are essays, long paragraphs, exactly what we want for it to do. So what's our 5-year business plan? What we had for lunch yesterday? A copy and paste from some project document that doesn't really explain what an individual user needs to do. They explain what the whole community of users need to do in total. You can't implement this. You need to break it down. You need to go through the long paragraphs of text. You need to try and pick out what's actually important, what actually describes what a user needs to do, break it down into separate requirements, challenge anything that seems irrelevant and discard it, or separate it out, and the ones that are real requirements need to be addressed at an individual level. At number 3, the user requires that feature X does not change. But no, feature X isn't documented. And what exactly can't change? How is this going to be tested if we don't really know what feature X does? And in order to actually proceed with a requirement like this, which is not really a requirement, it's a constraint, you need to describe from a user perspective what feature X actually does. And we also need to think quite clearly about what not change really means. Does it literally mean it needs to look exactly the same? Does it just need to perform the same functions in the same order? We don't really know without a bit more information. But constraints saying don't change this without further information are really unhelpful, and will end up with your new solution having to reconstruct behavior from previous versions that was never described properly in the first place. At number 2, the generic requirements along the lines of the user requires the app to have good usability, good security, good accessibility. If you just have a description saying good X, it doesn't really mean anything. You need to actually replace it with some specific measurable targets, or identify some sort of standards it needs to comply with. Without some sort of quantification, it's impossible to decide what this really means and whether you've met it. And number 1, my favorite that I've seen far too many times. The user needs the app to be bug-free. They have very interesting expectations sometimes, and it's not going to happen. We are not in the business of designing systems for spacecraft that you can spend millions of dollars on and still is potentially buggy. We aren't in that business. We are producing applications that are bound to have some bugs in, and what we need to understand is how we're going to deal with it to minimize the impact and to fix the most important bugs first. We need to manage customer expectations. We need to understand how we're going to prioritize bugs as they are identified. And we need to make sure that we have a sensible test QA strategy that identifies the bugs in the first place, rather than waiting for users to find them a few months down the line. So, hopefully, that's given you some idea of some of the things that can go badly wrong with user requirements. In terms of conclusions, really what I'd like to make sure that everyone goes away with is the message that everyone needs to keep thinking about user needs. It doesn't matter what your role is in development process, everyone needs to have the user need in mind. Bad requirements are not going to go away. We know that we are going to get bad requirements. We know that we'll probably produce bad requirements because writing good requirements is not an easy task. But we need to make sure that we are aware of what a bad requirement looks like and that we can challenge it and improve it before we waste too much time implementing a solution to it. And our customers don't always know what their real problem is, even if they were good at writing it down. So you could end up with a long, clear requirement without a good justification, and it might not actually address the problem that the customer really has. And again, we need to make sure that we get involved and we understand what the real needs of the users are, whether it's our customer or whether it's our customer's customers. And we need to make sure that we understand that what we get at the start of the project is going to be a starting point. We are not going to get something that is well-defined and complete and we just need to implement it. We always need to be thinking about what the users really want. We always need to be challenging. We always need to be improving. We need to keep requirements alive and up to date. And I think it's really important that everyone involved in the development process feels like they have some sort of stake in this. If you think a requirement is unclear, you need to put your hand up and say, I'm not quite sure what this means. We need to understand a bit better. And we need to make sure we are confident to do that sort of challenging at whatever the appropriate level is for a particular project. But if we don't constantly have user needs in mind, there is a risk that we will develop some really nice shiny products that are of no use to anyone because they don't meet the user's real needs. So that's pretty much it from me on requirements. But of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to answer. I know there is a Slido as well.